Thanks for joining us at Inclusion Fusion. My name is Katie Weatherby. I'm with Key Ministry, and I am very pleased to welcome today Steve Grcevich, who is a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and more importantly, he is the founder and the president of Key Ministry. Steve, thanks so much for joining us today. We're really glad that you've not only decided to come and speak at Inclusion Fusion, but that you invented Inclusion Fusion at all.
Well, Katie, thanks so much for your kind words. I'm just really excited about, people around the country and people around the world getting a chance to get to know you and Rebecca and Harmony and some of the fabulous people that I've just been honored to serve with on our team, as well as some really terrific folks that we've had a chance to work with around the country who are experts in different areas of children's and disability ministry. So I'm just really excited that this is all coming together and that people are going to meet a lot of new friends and learn a lot of new stuff this week.
Well, tell me something. We're talking today about kids with issues, the mission field next door. When you use the term kids with issues, what exactly do you mean? Because I don't think that's a medical term.
Well, when we're talking about kids with issues, part of what we've been focused on from the very inception of Key Ministry is helping churches to be able to serve, welcome, and include families of kids with what we'd refer to as hidden disabilities. So that when we're talking about issues, we're largely talking about kids who would have emotional, behavioral, developmental, or neurologic problems where there aren't outwardly apparent physical symptoms. So one way of thinking about it is that if a kid has a significant disability, but you can't capture it by taking a still photo, that would represent a hidden disability. And so going back to the mid-1990s, I was involved at the time in a really cool church on the west side of Cleveland, Bay Presbyterian, that was started to develop some resources and some services to support families from within the church who had adopted kids out of Russian and Bulgarian orphanages with some fairly complex emotional and behavioral problems. And, in the process of them starting up their ministry, it, dawned on me that, well, the kinds of kids that we would see, in a child psychiatry practice like the one that I worked in, maybe having some issues that would contribute to those kids and their families having a real hard time being able to make a connection with a local church family. So that around the time that Bay Press was starting up, I just started asking some screening questions of, all of the new kids and all the new families coming into our practice about where the child was at in terms of their spiritual development, where the family was at in terms of their ability to be able to, participate in a church or in a religious organization in terms of practicing their faith. And quite honestly, I was horrified by what I heard. And the reality is, and I want to be very careful with statistics, but in the 15 years since that time, if I had to give it a ballpark estimate, I would say that on any given Sunday, if a family has a child with a significant issue or hidden disability, I would guess it's at least 50% less likely that that family is involved with their church or their place of worship on the weekend, compared to families where they're not dealing with something like this.
Right. So as we think about this then, and we know that these are really busy times, and churches are being asked to meet a lot of demands, and churches are struggling with budgets and with staffing. So why this issue? Why should churches definitely create a purposeful strategy for ministering and including families of kids with issues?
Well, I think that the most compelling reason is that there are just way too many kids and way too many families that this touches to be able to ignore the problem. So when we're talking about things like hidden disabilities, we're referring to conditions like ADHD, anxiety disorders, kids with learning disabilities, kids with bipolar disorder, kids with, autism spectrum disorders, kids who have been in foster care or adopted where they may have some issues with attachment. And there was a study that came out last year in the Child Psychiatry Journal that showed that 22% of the kids entering first grade in the United States meet criteria for at least one psychiatric disorder.
Wow.
We know the statistics that 1 in 110 kids in the United States now have a diagnosis of an autism spectrum disorder. Around 9.5% of all kids in the United States between the ages of 4 and 17 have been treated with medication for attention deficit disorder. And in some states like North Carolina, the rate of parents identifying their kids as having been diagnosed with ADHD exceeds 15% at this point.
Wow.
8% of all adolescents in the United States meet criteria for at least one anxiety disorder. And in most instances, those conditions are apparent in kids by the time they turn age 6. A number of churches around the country that we're aware of are getting more involved from a missional standpoint in looking to serve and reach out and take in kids who are involved in the foster care system. And one of the things that the church is seeking to do this, and we think this is a very cool thing, by the way, but one of the things that they need to appreciate is that 38% of the kids in the foster care system, according to a study by Julie Zito out of the University of Maryland, are on some type of psychoactive medicine. 72% of that group of kids takes at least 2 different medications, and around 40% are on 3 or more different medicines. So that, increasingly, when we think about the folks that we have in our communities who aren't connected with a local church, this is going to be an issue that's going to touch many of them. And the number of kids that we're talking about here far exceeds the number that we would traditionally think about or who would identify themselves as having some sort of special need and fit into a lot of the existing ministries that, that have taken root and continue to grow around the United States.
So many of these families may not consider themselves families affected by disabilities, but yet they really do have a lot of struggles when it comes to taking part in church on a regular basis. So can you talk a little bit about what kinds of barriers these folks face?
Well, there are 4 or 5 different types of barriers that come to mind. And a couple of weeks ago, I know that you and I were at the Johnny and Friends Disability Ministry Summit. And, traditionally when people have thought about folks with disabilities, they've thought about physical barriers.
Right.
But there are a number of issues about the way that we may do church that pose significant barriers to kids who have these conditions in their families. The first issue has to do with the reality that a lot of kids that we're labeling as having quote-unquote issues really struggle in one way or another with their capacity for self-control. And so that when you're going into a church environment where the ability to be able to inhibit your behavior, to manage your emotions, to delay gratification, where that's really important, being able to meet the expectations that folks have, for a child's behavior there may be a significant struggle. I mean, in our home area here in Northeast Ohio, we work with a number of Roman Catholic churches. And the expectation in Catholic churches is that kids are going to be able to sit through the worship service of the Mass together with their parents with something that, for a 7 or an 8-year-old child, with no disability may not be particularly interesting. But they're asked to sit through it, in a place where maybe the seating's not really comfortable, where there are lots of potential distractions around, and where, what's being shared may not be particularly relevant for kids, of their particular age.
So it's really sort of extra difficult because some of what you described in terms of expected behavior would be considered spiritual ideals. And because of their diagnoses, they're unable to match up with those ideals. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Another way of thinking about this in terms of the barriers is that our friend and colleague Harmony Hensley from Vineyard in Cincinnati did a couple of blog posts on the blog that I write last month, looking specifically at the notion of hostile ministry environments.
Interesting.
In that, if you're a child, say like with an autism spectrum disorder, what we see sometimes with kids with different anxiety problems or ADHD, is that they have difficulty processing an excessive amount of sensory information. So that you think about what it's like for a kid who already struggles with self-control, they may experience like the loud music and the bright lights during an upbeat children's worship service is actually painful in some instances. or the sounds and the bustle, of hundreds of people coming in and coming out at the beginning or at the end of church may be really overwhelming. Or think about what it's like to be, like a little 5 or 6-year-old with separation anxiety, to be going to a new place, to be expected to go off, spend time with kids that they may not be familiar with. Well, their parent goes to a very different part of the campus or the building, and they're not able to be with them or see them. All of those things can be significant struggles for folks who have issues or hidden disabilities.
So even though we as the church are setting up ministry environments that we think will be fun and engaging, sometimes the kids that we're really seeking to serve the most might have a real struggle with those kinds of environments.
Well, exactly, because when the amount of sensory information or the amount of input that they have to process becomes overwhelming, if they have issues with self-control to begin with, it becomes that much harder to be able to marshal the mental resources, not only to be able to demonstrate a reasonable degree of control in terms of one's behavior, but you don't have the mental resources to be able to, to get the key points that are being communicated and to, to learn the things about Jesus that folks are hopefully trying to teach them through their worship services and their small groups.
So what then can churches do to bridge these barriers? Because on the one hand, I don't know of a church who doesn't want to welcome families affected by disabilities, hidden or unhidden. Every church that we've worked with really wants to do that. At the same time, they're trying to serve a large population of kids, many of whom, or most of whom, are typically developing. So how do we bridge that barrier to make it sort of an and both instead of an either or situation?
Well, I think that there are 4 different things that churches can do if they, are interested in reaching out to, connecting with, and bringing into the body of Christ families who have kids with these issues.
Okay.
I think that the first thing that they need to look at is that they may need to go out into the community and meet these folks, as opposed to waiting for the families to come to them. One of the ways that some churches have attempted to reach out is through holding respite events. And I know that Rebecca Hamilton from our team did a wonderful discussion about training and equipping churches to be able to do that. But another way that churches can reach out is through relational respite.
Okay.
And that you don't necessarily need to have a big program or a facility, that individual families or small groups within the church can identify folks that they know in the community who are struggling and do a home-based respite, but do it in such a way that they invite the families to build relationships with them, and they can be incorporated into their small groups and be incorporated, hopefully, and welcomed and invited into the life of the church in that way. There are other churches that we have worked with that have been intentional about going out in the community and finding ways of serving families who are struggling with kids with hidden disabilities.
Okay.
I know that one of the churches that we serve has about 150 adults who regularly go into the inner city schools to tutor kids who are falling behind academically or at risk. One of our local churches has approached us about training volunteers to be able to advocate for kids in a charter school that they're now running for children with learning disabilities when their time at the school is done and they need to be reintegrated into the public schools to be able to get the appropriate supports that they need. So going out in the community and serving them and meeting needs is one way of going about doing that. A second way would be to look at offering some training opportunities to the existing children's ministry staff, to key volunteers, to help them to be able to identify some of the signs that kids may be struggling with their church participation, and some specific strategies that they can then employ to help their time at the church or in church-based activities to be more successful. A third thing that churches can do is to take a look at their ministry environments. Even things, as basic as, the lighting in the church. How much noise or how much sound there is during different activities. Making sure that there's appropriate structure and supervision during transition times when kids are being picked up, when kids are being dropped off. So that kids who may be struggling with some sort of self-control issues, may be struggling with some sorts of sensory issues, are able to have a successful experience. And then the fourth thing that churches can do to help support the families is that families who have kids with these kinds of issues have a very hard time finding babysitters. So that if there are certain activities that a given church sees as being essential for building disciples and for spiritual development, so that, in some churches they have a fabulous pastor who's a great teacher, and so it's coming and listening to the messages on Sunday that's really critical. For some churches, it's small group involvement. For some churches, it's being actively involved in serving.
Okay.
But if you're serious about wanting to be able to help to support these families and to help to give them the resources and the relationships that they need to fulfill their primary responsibility of being their child's faith trainer, offering the supports of the family so that they can make use of all the cool stuff that their church has to offer is something that's really critical.
All right. Well, I'm sold, obviously. I wholeheartedly believe in this. But I'm not the pastor of a church who is managing multiple programs and multiple people. You've been on the elder board at 2 different large churches. If you were advising someone who's listening to this talk today, who has a real passion for special needs ministry, what advice would you give for sort of selling this idea to the church leadership and helping them to understand the urgency?
Well, first off, one of the things that I would share is that you don't have to start a new program if that's not what your church does. We're more than happy, our team at Key Ministry, to help people to do that. There are a number of, fine speakers and leaders who also help churches set up disability ministries. But ideally, I think that you can serve almost all of these kids within the context of the programming that your church already offers. So you don't have to set up a new program. I think it's important for them to understand that if they do have a special needs ministry, a lot of folks who are struggling with these kinds of issues aren't necessarily going to benefit from it or see it as something that would be a resource to them because, even though I know in one of our local school systems, one of the school board members had shared with me that over a third of the kids in the school district are on either an individualized education plan or some accommodation plan because of a significant disability. The vast preponderance of those kids and their parents would never think about the kids as being quote-unquote disabled or having a special need.
But does the learning disability or the attention issue take a day off on Sunday?
Unfortunately, it does not.
Right. So those needs are going to exist on Sundays as well.
I think it's important to understand that most of these kids aren't going to need buddies to be successful because a big concern in a lot of churches is, was it going to take away so many volunteers that it negatively impacts our ability to do some of the other things that we think are important? And that, our job, as Key Ministry is to help churches answer the questions and come up with the strategies to get the children involved and their families involved in exactly those things that the church has found most effective in building disciples. So that in my mind, where the win occurs is that whenever a child with a hidden disability or one of their family members has a meaningful connection with a local church family, we've won and the kingdom's won.
That's great. That's great. Okay, so how can folks access what Key Ministry offers, and how can we then, as a ministry, respond to the teams in churches who need help in getting going?
Well, one of the things that we felt is important is that, with all the barriers that exist between the families that we hope to see connect, and the churches that hope to serve them, we don't want money to be an additional barrier, so that everything we offer is free. So that all of our training, all of our consultation, all of our resources, all of our support is absolutely free of charge. And, we're more than happy to give that as a gift because that's what Jesus did for us. And that's a neat way to pay it forward. Some of the things that I would hope churches would take advantage of, beyond this opportunity here with Inclusion Fusion, is that we are going to be setting up something after the conference that will allow churches everywhere to get access to video training that's been created by folks from our team. And we're very thankful to Jeremy and our partners with, Pajama Conference for helping us to be able to do that. One of the things that I think is nevertheless really important is that folks have an opportunity to have a personal touch with training. And so that one of the things that you've been instrumental in doing for us is setting up jam sessions, which are intensive opportunities, one day for now, but maybe 2 days beginning in 2012, for folks to come to here in Cleveland several times next year, or in different places around the country. This year they've been in Cincinnati and in Des Moines, Iowa, for an opportunity to get leadership training and to get all the resources they'll need to launch one of these ministry initiatives in their local church. And so we love getting an opportunity to meet folks and do that. But at the same time, modern technology is a great thing. We have Skype. We have phones. And that one of the things that I know that you and Rebecca have very much enjoyed doing is fielding emails and phone calls, from children's ministers, from parents, from youth pastors, and from high-capacity volunteers. And you've been willing to email with them, get on the phone, in some cases when we're in the area, go out and do some live observation or consultation, and brainstorm the little kinds of problems that arise when you get a complicated kid where you're just trying to figure out what the best way is to serve them. So I hope you don't mind that I'm doing this, but if you want to email Katie at katie@keyministry.org, I'm sure that she would be more than happy to field those emails and be of service.
I would be very happy to do. That's my favorite part of my job, is getting to problem solve with churches. So Steve, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. I think it's so rare and wonderful that a physician with your expertise is also so committed to growing the kingdom. And I know this is your day off and you're spending all day with us filming today because that's where your heart's desire is, to see the kingdom grow. So thank you. And thank you for joining us for Inclusion Fusion. We hope that this has been helpful to you. Again, if you have questions or if you need more help, you can reach us at www.keyministry.org.